We're basically experimenting right now how to go through this material with, and then measure the level of comprehension, because there's several challenges. One is obviously the events and style of writing is a century and a half old, as well as the content is written in a different language and it's really translated. So there are certain style of writing which may be confusing overall. But the first segment that we read really relates to the history in terms of a general concept of basically how Islam came about, divisions within Islam, which were Sunnis and Shiites, and within the Shiites, which is the primary focus of our discussion, which and basically ecclesiastical challenges to the Shiites, which there were two groups, Akhbaris and Usulis one, which really they represent basically interpretation of Quran and Hadith based on ulama, or basically mujtahid, people that were studying and interpreting those. And they built a hierarchy of ecclesiastical order which had the authority to translate those. Usulis were, so Akhbaris basically got wiped out, people that were strictly saying no, authoritarian translation is not necessary, all the stuff that needs to be said is in Quran and Hadith and 4 major books. So those guys were wiped out, but the difference between the two, Akhbaris and Usulis, were in minor differences, not the major principles of the Islamic religion in Shiite doctrine, which really believes the 12 Imams, descendant of Muhammad, that had the leadership of and interpretive right to interpret the Quran and Hadith, and so on. And of course, this Sunni branch, which really believed in elders being the leaders of the community in general, and references would go to the Islamic books, which is Hadith and Quran, for that matter. So going back into the situation with Usulis, there was no real challenge to them until basically Sheikh Ahmad Ahsa'i came to the picture with fusing some of the understandings of Sufis related to allegorical representation of end of time. So Sheikhis, which are the followers of Sheikh Ahmad Ahsa'i, he really presents a different view of end of time, where Shiite believe that this occultation of the 12th Imam, when he comes back, he's going to basically start, first of all, celestial bodies would drop on earth and everybody gets resurrected and they're going to be judged and so on and so forth. Ironically, we looked at some of the components and ideas, which is very similar to Old and New Testament doctrine regarding end of time. But unfortunately, majority of Muslims today believe in that physical, literal interpretation of this end of time and coming of the Messiah. So what Sheikh Ahmad did is say, look, these things are actually allegorical, and based on calculations he made, and later on we'll see in the first chapter, the stories related to even birth of Bab and birth of Baha'u'llah, that he was predicting that during his followers' lifetime, they would see this major event occurring. So Sheikh Ahmad's difference was this major thing, and obviously ecclesiastical doctors didn't like this idea of continuation of the religion itself. Everybody is waiting for everything to disappear, generally, which is really not the real meaning of the end of time that was described. So majority of this cultural, literal interpretation came in from the ecclesiastical order to really safeguard their own position and their own hierarchy, which is fairly similar to Catholicism with the Pope and bishops and so on and so forth. So this contrast, obviously, Sheikh Ahmad, this challenge that he produced, and he was ironically differentiating his doctrine from Sufis, where major reason Islam actually propagated throughout the world was through Sufis and Sufism in general, which ironically is not a religion. It's a pantheistic religion where they believe a piece of God is in everyone, so collectively all of us create God. This is a very interesting concept. But the advantage of this was that it's tolerance of every culture. So when they were approaching people to make people Muslims, and they think this Sufism is a spiritual side of Islam, but truly it has a big paradox with religion itself, because the world of deity, world of manifestation, and world of subjects are three different worlds, where Sufis believe that if you basically relinquish your will and study Quran and be a pious person, you can be like Muhammad. You can be communicating with God. Where Muslims really believe after death they would go to heaven and then commune with everybody else. So there is a really contrast in terms of Sufism versus Shaykhism. So Shaykhism has nothing to do with Sufism at all. So Shaykhis were preparing basically the community of Shiite Muslim to look for this Messiah, this person that is going to come in. So that was what we discussed. And of course, there's a certain historical event that occurred, which we read. And so what we're going to do is, for us, we have to be very careful in terms of to understand the condition that existed from ecclesiastical order, from societal order, from a governmental order, from law itself. And this second segment that we're going to go through would put us and frame of our mind in terms of what conditions these humans were operating. And the title is very self-explanatory, which is Persia's State of Decadence in the middle of the 19th century. That means it was decaying, basically. It's completely decayed. And Baha'u'llah himself mentioned that if there was any other place on earth that was a worse situation for humanity, I would have been resurrected from that side. So the key is for us to put our frame of mind in terms of what kind of atrocities, what kind of system existed, and what would happen to those heroes of religion that arose trying to really reverse this process of decay in the society and bring in a new life. And of course, one of the paragraphs that we read, that Sheikh Ahmad knew that the Islamic religion in the state that was in was not reformable. And that's why he saw the signs that were in Hadith and Quran related to the end of time, that where the society is going to be. So he saw those elements around himself. So he deducted that you can't basically reform the current situation. A new religion has to come, and he was expecting it.
It's Qajar, is that how you pronounce it?
Qajar, right.
Qajar sovereigns.
Right.
In theory, the king may do what he pleases. His word is law. The saying that the law and the Medes and Persians alter it not was merely an ancient paraphrases for the absolutism of the sovereign. He appoints and he may dismiss all ministers, officials, officers, and judges over his own family and household and over the civil or military functionaries in his employ. He has the power of life and death without reference to any tribunal. The property of any such individuals, if disgraced or executed, reverts to him. The right to take life in any case is vested in him alone, and can be delegated to governors or deputies. All property not previously granted by the crown or purchased, all property, in fact, to which a legal title cannot be established, belongs to him and can be disposed of at his pleasure. All rights or privileges, such as the making of public works, the working of mines, the institution of telegraphs, roads, railways, tramways, etc., the exploitation, in fact, of any of the resources of the country are vested in him and must be purchased from him before they can be assumed by others. In his person are fused the threefold functions of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. No obligation is imposed upon him beyond the outward observance of the forms of the national religion. He is the pivot upon which turns the entire machinery of public life.
Okay, so here this is absolute monarchy, and the interesting part is, from an economic point of view, is that you had to have purchased whatever you have, your land, from him. So it's the issue of having complete economic control, and all he had to do is disgrace somebody and take the guy's property back. So it's like a complete authoritarian bank that he would basically retrieve his offers or his givings to other people at will as well. Okay. Any questions here? Let's move on. Reading.
Such is, in theory, and was till lately in practice, the character of the Persian monarchy. Nor has a single one of these high pretensions have been overtly conceded. The language in which the Shah addressed his subjects and is addressed by them recalls the proud tone in which an Artaxerxes spoke of to his tribunal millions, and which may still be read in the graven record of rock wall and tomb. He remains the Shah or King of Kings, the Zillullah, or Shadow of God, the Qibli Alam, or Center of the Universe, exalted like the planet Saturn, well of science, footpath of heaven, sublime sovereign, whose standard is the sun, whose splendor is that of the firmament. Monarch of armies, numerous as the stars, still the Persian subject endorsed the precept of Sadi, that the vice approved by the king becomes a virtue. To seek opposite counsel is to imbue one's hands in his own blood. The march of time has imposed upon him neither religious council nor secular council, neither ulama nor senate. Elective and representative institutions have not yet intruded their irreverent features. No written check exists upon the royal prerogative. Such is the divinity that doth hinge hedge a throne in Persia. That not merely does the Shah never attend at state dinners or eat with his subjects at table, with the exception of a single banquet to his principal male relatives at Nowruz, but the attitude and language employed towards him, even by his confidential ministers, are those of servile obeisance and adulation. May I be your sacrifice, asylum of the universe, is the common mode of address adopted even by the subjects of the highest rank. In his own surroundings, there is no one to tell him the truth or to give him dispassionate counsel. The foreign ministers are probably almost the only source from which he learns facts as they are, or receives unvarnished, even if interested, advice. With the best intentions of the world, for the undertaking of great plans and for the amelioration of his country, he has little or no control over the execution of an enterprise which has once passed out of his hands and has become the sport of corrupt and self-seeking officials. Half the money voted with his consent never reaches its destination, but sticks to every intervening pocket with which a professional ingenuity can bring it into transient contact. Half the schemes authorized by him are never brought any nearer to realization. The minister or functionary in charge, trusting to the oblivious caprices of the sovereign to overlook his dereliction of duty. Only a century ago, the abominable system prevailed of blinding possible aspirants to the throne, of savage mutilations and lifelong captivities, of wanton slaughter and systematic bloodshed. Disgrace was not less sudden than promotion, and death was a frequent
Concomitant of disgrace.
Fath Ali Shah and his successors after him have proved so extraordinarily prolific a male offspring that the continuity of the dynasty hath been assured. And there is probably not a reigning family in the world that in the space of 100 years has swollen to such ample dimensions as the royal race of Persia. Neither in the number of his wives nor in the extent of his progeny can the Shah, although undeniably a family man, be compared with his great-grandfather, Fath Ali Shah. To the high opinion universally held of the domestic capacities of that monarch must, I imagine, be attributed to the divergent estimates that are to be found in works about Persia of the number of his concubines and children. Colonel Drewville in 1813 credits him with 700 wives, 64 sons, and 125 daughters. Colonel Stewart, who was in Persia in the year after the Fath Ali's death, gave him 1,000 wives and 105 children. Madame Dulafoy also names the 5,000 descendants, but as existing at an epoch 50 years later, which has a greater probability. The estimate which appears in the
Nasikh al-Tawarikh,
a great modern Persian historical work, fixes the number of Fath Ali's wives as over 1,000, and of his offspring as 260, 110 of whom survived their father. Hence the familiar Persian proverb, camels, fleas, and princes exist everywhere. No royal family has ever afforded a more exemplary illustration of the scriptural assurance. Instead of thy fathers, thou shalt have children, whom thou mayest make princes for all lands. For there was scarcely a governorship or a post of emolument in Persia that was not filled by one of this beehive of princelings. And to this day, the myriad brood of Shahzadis, or descendants of a king, is a perfect curse to the country. Curse to the country. Although many of these luckless
scions
who consume a large portion of the revenue and annual allowances and pensions now occupy very inferior positions as telegraph clerks, secretaries, etc. Fraser drew a vivid picture of the misery entailed upon that country 50 years ago, 1852, by this race of royal drones who filled the governing posts not merely of every province, but of every bullock or district, city and town, each of whom kept up a court and a huge harem, and who preyed upon the country like a swarm of locusts. Fraser, passing through Adhirajan in 1834 and observing the calamitous results of the system under which Fath Ali Shah distributed his colossal male progeny in every government post throughout the kingdom, remarked, the most obvious consequence of this state of affairs is a thorough and universal detestation of the Qajar race, which is a prevalent feeling in every heart and the theme of every tongue. Just as in the course of his, Nasruddin Shah's, European travels, he picked up a vast number of what appeared to the Eastern mind to be wonderful curiosities, but which have been stacked in the various apartments of the palace or put away and forgotten. So in the larger sphere of public policy and administration, which he is continually taking up and pushing, some new scheme or invention which the caprice has gratified is neglected or allowed to expire. One week it is gas, another it is electric lights. Now it is a staff college and on a military hospital. Today it is a Russian uniform. Yesterday it was a German man of war for the Persian Gulf. A new army warrant is issued this year. A new code of law is promised for the next. Nothing comes of any of these brilliant schemes, and the lumber rooms of the palace are not more full of broken mechanism and discarded bric-a-brac than are the pigeonholes of the government bureau of abortive reforms and dead fiascos. In an upper chamber of the same pavilion, Mirza Abdul Qasim, the Qayyim Magam, or Grand Vizier of Muhammad Shah, the father of the present monarch, was strangled in 1835 by order of his royal master, who therein followed an example set by his predecessor, and set one himself that was duly followed by his son. It must be rare in history to find these three successive sovereigns who have been put to death. From jealous motives only, the three ministers who have either raised them to the throne or were, at the time of their fall, filling the highest office in the state. Such is the triple distinction of Fath Ali Muhammad and Nasruddin Shah's.
Great. So it's pretty self-explanatory of what was generally happening. And ironically, for them to basically dominate the control over the country, they used their own kin to penetrate in every layer of society. And of course, it was mentioned related to all the natural resources or services that was provided were provided by the government and was controlled by his kin. So it's a complete control into minute detail of governing basically Iran at the time. Any questions, concerns on that area?
Well, the concern in that area is that Persian culture, going back to the time of when the Greeks decided to create a semi-democracy in their country, has always tended to go the direction that is gone for the past 2,500 years, to set something, an idol above themselves, of their own kind, which was the monarchy. And when Xerxes found out that this hoopla was happening in Greece, he attacked Greece because he didn't want that democracy to ooze into Persia, and then he had to be replaced. And the influence of that has gone in
Yeah.
and never accepted to compromise with time.
Of course, the reality related to the kingdom since the dynasty of Safavid that adopted this church and state followed this. Prior to that, actually, all religions within Persian Empire was sacred. And even when Darius invaded the country, released actually prisoners of conscience and prisoners of religion. And these are really common area. The church state really came to Iran during this dynasty of Turks, which is really last 400 years. In general, although the religion of the state was Zoroastrian at the time, but no one was forced to convert during the dynasties in Iran. This process of basically cleansing, religious cleansing, started with Shiites. And of course, there are several different doctrines related to why Shiism came to Iran, although it was a quite minority and unknown religion at the time. But some say it was a political division that need to be created to keep borders of this Iran separate from Ottoman Empire. There are other theories in general, but through, of course, Baha'is believe in the Shiite branch of Islam to be the true Islam, although it was not popular. Of course, when you're looking at the religion and doctrines of religion, what people do with the religion has nothing to do with the religion itself. Of course, through socio-political and economics situation that followed suit by bringing Shiism into Iran, created this doctrine of church state, which this concept never existed before. It's the first time in the history of humanity, actually, that, or Iran, I'm sorry, in the Middle East, that this power was given to the religion, and the head of the state would control both spiritual and religious activities of its subjects. So let's look at the government. Diane, you want to read?
In a country so backward in constitutional progress, so destitute of forms and statutes and charters, so firmly stereotyped in the immemorial traditions of the East, the personal element, as might be expected, is largely in the ascendant, and the government of Persia is little else than the arbitrary exercise of authority by a series of units of descending scale from the sovereign to the headman of a petty village. The only check that operates upon the lower official grades is the fear of their superiors, which means can usually be found to assuage upon the higher ranks of the fear of the sovereign, who is not always closed against similar methods of pacification, and upon the sovereign himself the fear, not the native, but the foreign opinion, as represented in the hostile criticism of the European press. The Shah, indeed, may be regarded at this moment as perhaps the most existing specimen of a modern despot, for within the elements indicated, he is practically irresponsible and omnipotent. He has absolute command over the life and poverty of every one of his subjects. His sons have no independent power, and can be reduced to impotence or bigotry in the twinkling of an eye. The ministers are elevated and degraded in the royal pleasure. The sovereign is the sole executive of the officials of his deputies. No civil tribunals are in existence to check or modify his prerogative. Of the general character and accomplishments of the ministers of the Persian court, Sir J. Malcolm, in his history, wrote as follows in the early years of century. The ministers and the chief offices of the court are almost always men of polished manners, were skilled in the business of respective departments, of pleasant conversation, subdued temper, and very acute observation. But the agreeable and useful qualities are in general all that they possess. Nor is it a virtue or a tribal knowledge, liberal knowledge, to be expected in men whose lives are wasted in attending to forms, whose mean of subsistence are derived from the most corrupt sources, whose occupation is intrigues that have always the same objects, to preserve themselves or ruin others, who cannot without danger speak any language but that of flattery and deceit, and who are, in short, condemned by their condition to be venal, artful, and false. They have no doubt been many ministers of Persia whom it would be injustice to class them under this general description. But even the most distinguished of their virtues and talents have been forced in some degree to accommodate their principles and their station, and unless there's confidence in their sovereign has placed them far beyond the fear of rivals. Necessity has compelled them to practice of a subserviency and disillumination of variance with the truth and integrity, which can alone constitute a claim to the respect of all disposed to grant to good and to great men. These observations are marked by the insight and justice characteristic of their distinguished author, and it may be feared that to the large extent, they hold as good a presence as the old generation.
So it's really clear now that how these guys were controlling the process and basically assigning, and none of the dollars that were collected through taxes would really go back to getting anything done. So everything was getting filtered to this complete bureaucracy that was created, and barely they were saying even 25% of the project was even get started and never finished. So first of all, it appeared that almost 75% of the revenues that were getting generated was getting into the pockets of filtered down, and barely those few projects that were supposedly suggested or referenced in foreign countries that they want to adopt, those would never materialize either. So it was a complete pyramid scheme to basically deplete assets of the population and keep them in chains generally. Okay. I now come, right.
C, the people. I now come to that which is the cardinal and differentiating feature of the Iranian administration. Government, nay, life itself in that country may be said to consist for the most part of an interchange of presents. Under its social aspect, this practice may be supposed to illustrate the generous sentiments of an amiable people, though even here it has a grimly unemotional side, as, for instance, when congratulating yourself upon being the recipient of a gift, you find that not only must you make a return of equivalent cost to the donor, but must also liberally remunerate the bearer of the gift, to whom your return is very likely the sole recognized means of subsistence, in a ratio proportionate to its pecuniary value. Under its political aspects, the practice of gift-making though consecrated in the adamantine traditions of the East, is synonymous with the system elsewhere described by less agreeable names. This is the system on which the government of Persia has been conducted for centuries, and the maintenance of which opposes a solid barrier to any real reform. From the Shah downwards, there is scarcely an official who is not open to gifts, scarcely a post which is not conferred in return for gifts, scarcely an income which has not been amassed by the receipt of gifts. Every individual, with hardly an exception, in the official hierarchy above mentioned, has only purchased his post by a monetary present either to the Shah, or to a minister, or to the superior governor by whom he has been appointed. If there are several candidates for a post, in all probability, the one who makes the best offer will win. The Madakhil is a cherished national institution in Persia, the exaction of which, in a myriad different forms, whose ingenuity is only equaled by their multiplicity, is the crowning interest and delight of a Persian's existence. This remarkable word, for which Mr. Watson says there is no precise English equivalent, may be variously translated as commission, perquisite, dossier, consideration, pickings and stealings, profit, according to the immediate context in which it is employed. Roughly speaking, it signifies that balance of personal advantage, usually expressed in money form, which can be squeezed out of any and every transaction. A negotiation in which two parties are involved as donor and recipient, as superior and subordinate, or even as equal contracting agents, cannot take place in Persia without the party who can be represented as the author of the favor or service claiming and receiving a definite cash return for what he has done or given. It may, of course, be said that human nature is much the same all the world over, that a similar system exists under a different name in our own or other countries, and that the philosophic critic will welcome in the Persian a man and a brother. To some extent, this is true. But in no country that I have ever seen or heard of in this world is the system so open, so shameless, or so universal as in Persia. So far from being limited to the sphere of domestic economy or to commercial transactions, it permeates every walk and inspires most of the actions of life. By its operation, generosity or gratuitous service may be said to have been erased in Persia from the category of social virtues, and cupidity has been elevated into the guiding principle of human conduct. Hereby is instituted an arithmetical progression of plunder from the sovereign to the subject, each unit in the descending scale remunerating himself from the unit next in rank below him, and the hapless peasant being the ultimate victim. It is not surprising, under these circumstances, that office is the common avenue to wealth, and that cases are frequent of men who, having started from nothing, are found residing in magnificent houses, surrounded by crowds of retainers and living in princely style. Make what you can while you can is the rule that most men set before themselves in entering public life. Nor does popular spirit resent the act. The estimation of anyone who, enjoying the opportunity, has failed to line his own pockets, being the reverse of complimentary to his sense. No one turns a thought to the sufferers from whom, in the last resort, the material for these successive madakhils has been derived, and from the sweat of whose uncomplaining brow has been wrung the wealth that is dissipated in luxurious country houses, European curiosities, and enormous retinues. Among the features of public life in Persia that most quickly strike the stranger's eye, and that indirectly arise from the same conditions, is the enormous number of attendants and retainers that swarm round a minister or official of any description. In the case of a functionary of rank or position, these vary in number from 50 to 500. Benjamin says that the prime minister in his time kept 3,000. Now, the theory of social and ceremonial etiquette that prevails in Persia, and indeed throughout the East, is to some extent responsible for this phenomenon. Personal importance being to a large extent estimated by the public show which it can make, and by the staff of servants whom on occasions it can parade. But it is this institution of marakhil and of illicit pickings and stealings that is the root of the evil. If the governor or minister were bound to pay salaries to the whole of this servile crew, their ranks would speedily dwindle. The bulk of them are unpaid. They attach themselves to their master because of their opportunities for extortion with which that connection presents them, and they thrive and fatten on plunder. It may readily be conceived how great a drain is this swarm of bloodsuckers upon the resources of the country. They are true types of unproductive laborers, absorbing but never creating wealth, and their existence is little short of a national calamity. It is the cardinal point of Persian etiquette when you go out visiting to take as many of your own establishment with you as possible, whether riding or walking on foot, the number of such retinue being accepted as an indication of the rank of the master.
Okay, I think it's pretty self-explanatory related to how people survive in those conditions. One thing that is not really mentioned in here, which I want to present, is that the system of banking system also was controlled through the processes where clergy was involved as well. So they could actually control the assets of people as well. So it's a very complex socioeconomic, which was mixed with the religious type of doctrine that could actually allow one person plunder somebody else's assets without any repercussion from the authorities themselves. So, for example, a lot of clergy would go and borrow money from the merchants, and they would never pay it back. And this was understood, that this is how the system would function, because they had authority or fatwas. They could actually issue edicts to get rid of the guy. So it's a very complex, corrupt system that existed in terms of how their doctrine was infused. And we'll read this in the next paragraph related to basically ecclesiastical order, which really divided into different branches, even some called Sayyids, which were descendant of the Muhammad, and they had basically green turbans. So there were many different systems that were in place, and they demanded authority and ability to influence the system itself. So when we read this ecclesiastical order, it's very important, for example, this descendant of the prophet, how they would influence these illiterate, uneducated people that were basically their livelihood was sucked by this system of government that were under the king, which were plundering their asset, as well as spiritually, they had no safe haven at all, because the clergy were controlling their quote-unquote spiritual life. First of all, the concept of church-state only occurred during the Safavid and, of course, Qajar dynasty. There is no precedence in Iran where the basically kings, there was no church-state environment. The kings, although they were Zoroastrian, they weren't excluding other religion, and they were hierarchy from way before in terms of legal systems and who could be judged, which had no inclination that basically ecclesiastical people were in charge. Although, because as a class, and this is one of the major reasons Islam came to Iran, was because the Zoroastrian priests were creating a caste system. And of course, this is the deterioration of the religious doctrine that was present at the time, which was Zoroastrian religion, which was dominant religion. And they were creating caste of, for example, priests, the caste of the kings and their offsprings, the caste of merchants and caste of peasants. And you couldn't even cross these castes. So the whole caste system at the time of Zoroastrian, when Islam came to Iran, of course it appeared to be by force, but reality of it is completely different, because they were bringing for the first time equality and breaking down this caste system. So people, before even them coming to Iran, they themselves would help them to get rid of the Zoroastrian priests or the corruption of the religion that occurred at the time. But this concept of church-state is completely different. The history of, obviously, kings, and like any other system, eventually goes to its zenith of flourishing, and then it dies away. But when you're looking at this doctrine, it's a completely different concept. When basically religion becomes and head of the religion becomes representative of God, basically. Well, this is the whole point. The whole point is, and this is the experiment that they have done, and it's happening now. What you're relating is that when there is no competing branches that can challenge the system itself, it would only stay there until it dies. There is no reform. And that's really what Sheikh Ahmad Asai saw. There was no way they could reform these people or reform the system itself. But the point I'm trying to make is very important from point of view of there was no alternative. When you have actually majority of the government and people that were related to those were part of the system itself, they were feeding from it. So there was no way that anybody could take arms and go against the government, because there was no hierarchy, and the church that could pose a challenge to the government was the same thing. So there was no challenge at all in the system. And the challenges really occurred during this Bab'i dispensation and Shaykhi dispensation, Shaykhi movement that end up in Bab'i movement in general. Yeah, the reason, the very recent example is really South Africa, when you have a bunch of white people with machine guns could control the entire society. They control basically commerce, they control the government, they control the army. So what ends up happening is that you can enslave people. And it was a modern example. And unless the world says, no, we will not tolerate this type of apartheid government, it imploded because they found out that they cannot exist. Financially, their economy would collapse. That's why they gave it up. But this particular force at the time didn't exist because they were, as you mentioned, they benefited from the structure itself. So the only thing that could have happened was this basically Bab'i movement, which really started the process of bringing the truth. So maybe...
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
The ecclesiastical order, marvelously adapted alike to the climate, character, and occupations of those countries upon which it has laid its adamantine grip, Islam holds its votary in complete thrall from the cradle to the grave. To him, it is not only religion, it is government, philosophy, and science as well. The Mohammedan conception is not so much that of a state church as, if the phrase may be permitted, of a church state. The undergirdles with which society itself is warped round are not of civil, but of ecclesiastical fabrication, and wrapped in this superb, if paralyzing, creed, the Muslim lives in contented surrender of all volitions, dreams it his highest duty to worship God, and to compel, or where impossible, to despise those who do not worship him in the spirit, and then dies in sure and certain hope of paradise. These Sayyids, or descendants of the Prophet, are an intolerable nuisance to the country, deducing from their alleged descent and from the prerogative of the green turban the right to an independence and insolence of bearing from which their countrymen, no less their foreigners, are made to suffer. As a community, the Persian Jews are sunk in great poverty and ignorance. Throughout the Muslim countries of the East, these unhappy people have been subjected to the persecution which custom has taught themselves, as well as the world, to regard as their normal lot. Usually compelled to live apart in a ghetto or a separate quarter of the towns, they have from time immemorial suffered from disabilities of occupation, dress, and habits which have marked them out as a social pariahs from their fellow creatures. In Isfahan, where there are said to be 3,700 and where they occupy a relatively better status than elsewhere in Persia, they are not permitted to wear the kula, or Persian headdress, to have shops in the bazaar, to build the walls of their houses as high as a Muslim neighbor's, or to ride in the streets. As soon, however, as any outburst of bigotry takes place in Persia or elsewhere, the Jews are apt to be the first victims. Every man's hand is then against them, and woe betide the luckless Hebrew who is the first to encounter a Persian street mob. Perhaps the most extraordinary feature of Mashhad life, before I leave the subject of the shrine and the pilgrims, is the provision that is made for the material solace of the latter during their stay in the city. In recognition of the long journeys which they have made, of the hardships which they have sustained, and of the distances by which they are severed from family and home, they're permitted, with the connivance of the ecclesiastical law and its officers, to contract temporary marriages during their sojourns in the city. There is a large permanent population of wives suitable for the purpose. A mullah is found under whose sanction a contract is drawn up and formally sealed by both parties. A fee is paid, and the union is legally accomplished. After the lapse of a fortnight or a month, or whatever be the specified period, the contract terminates. The temporary husband returns to his own latepenat in some distant clime, and the lady, after an enforced of celibacy of 14 days' duration, resumes her career of persevering matrimony. In other words, a gigantic system of prostitution under the sanction of the church prevails in Mashhad. There is probably not a more immoral city in Asia, and I should be sorry to say how many of the unmurmuring pilgrims who traverse seas and lands to kiss the grating of the Imam's tomb are not also encouraged and consoled upon their march by the prospect of an agreeable holiday and what might be described in the English vernacular as a good spree. Conclusion. Before I quit the subject
So
of the
any question, great, you should read the rest of it, but any questions on this paragraph? So they basically control the entire prostitution. Right, so the question is, the key element that is here is not clear, relates to Mashhad is one of the most sacred cities in the entire Shiite basically doctrine, which Imam Reza, the tomb of Imam Reza is in there. I think Hushain can maybe shed some light. He's from Sabzawar, which is close. So he can, actually his grandfather was a Baha'i as well. So it was quite interesting actually the process and this question of what did they do to other religious minorities in general. For example, in Hamadan, which one of my grandfather came from, and these were Jews that became Baha'is generally. They were the doctors of the mullahs and the governor of town. But what happened is that during rainy days, they had to wear a patch. So Muslims wouldn't touch them because they thought if it rains and the water splashes from their bodies, it would make them impure. So you have to see the level of superstition and how they control the population through these processes.
Did this superstition come as a part of the religion of Islam, or did it come as a warped interpretation by opportunists?
Well, remember, the collapse of a religion, like any other entity, we discussed in prior cases laws of entropy. Anything that is has a organic life or inorganic life dies. So what we are seeing is actually the remnant of, so we shouldn't confuse Islam with what is practiced today or was practiced then.
But Islam does say, I'm the best, I'm the final.
No, it doesn't. These are interpretation. That's the whole point. If you look at, for example, even writings of the Imams, when the writings becomes available and people claiming to be agent of God interpret those, because they're human, they translate it to their own advantage. What ends up happening, we get to where we are today. Reality is that Islam is not the only religion that this happened to, generally. When you look at, for example, Christianity, this concept of Trinity doesn't exist anywhere in Bible. This was created during Council of Nicaea, and they couldn't reconcile the words that was in Bible related to the Father, the Son, and Holy Ghost. And they say, well, how could we reconcile this? Let's say this is the same person in three different states, something like that. So, but this had nothing to do with Bible, or whatever they're doing had nothing to do with Quran. Of course, this is the time where basically everyone has to be educated enough and educated himself and take individual responsibility to teach himself and interpret for himself what the laws are from point of view of spiritual laws that exist. So it's a really contrast, and of course you couldn't expect this during the Muhammad's time, where 95% of people were illiterate, they couldn't even read or write. The structure of the interpreter was necessary at the time, but that particular doctrine no longer is necessary. Conclusion.
Before I quit the subject of the Persian law and its administration, let me add a few words upon the subject of penalties and prisons. Nothing is more shocking to the European reader in pursuing his way through the crime-stained and bloody pages of Persian history during the last and, in a happily less degree, during the present century, than the record of savage punishments and abominable tortures, testifying alternately to the callousness of the brute and the ingenuity of the fiend. The Persian character has even been fertile in device and indifferent to suffering, and in the field of judicial executions, it has found ample scope for the exercise of both attainments. Up till quite a recent period, well within the borders of the present reign, condemned criminals have been crucified, blown from guns, buried alive, impaled, shod like horses, torn asunder by being bound to the heads of two trees bent together, and then allowed to spring back to their natural position, converted into human torches, flayed while living. Under a twofold governing system such as that of which I have now completed the description, namely an administration in which every actor is, in different aspects, both the briber and the bribed, and a judicial procedure without either a law or a law court, it will readily be understood that confidence in the government is not likely to exist, that there is no personal sense of duty or pride of honor, no mutual trust or cooperation, except in the service of ill-doing, no disgrace and exposure, no credit and virtue, above all, no national spirit or patriotism. Those philosophers are right who argue that moral must precede material and internal exterior reform in Persia. It is useless to graft the new shoots onto a stem whose own sap is exhausted or poisoned. We may give Persia roads and railroads. We may work her mines and exploit her resources. We may drill her army and clothe her artisans, but we shall not have brought her within the pale of civilized nations until we have got at the core of the people and given a new and a radical twist to the national character and institutions. I have drawn this picture of Persian administration, which I believe to be true, in order that English readers may understand the system with which reformers, whether foreigners or natives, have to contend, and the iron wall of resistance built up by all the most selfish instincts in human nature that is opposed to progressive ideas. The Shah himself, however genuine his desire for innovation, is to some extent enlisted on the side of this pernicious system, seeing that he owes to it his private fortune, while those who most loudly condemn it in private are not behind their fellows in outwardly bowing their heads in the temple of Rimmon. In every rank below the sovereign, the initiative is utterly wanting to start a rebellion against the tyranny of immemorial custom, and if a strong man like the present king can only tentatively undertake it, where is he who shall preach the crusade?
Remember, this is actually a view from a third party, a European that has seen actually civilization and describing an environment, a Christian actually, that is describing, of course, a Christian that has gone through Renaissance, separation of church and state. And they only adopted the basically good of Christianity in a spiritual reform that had occurred and separated church from state, where, of course, between 14th to 17th centuries, Islam went the other direction. They went basically fusing church to the state and controlling the entire environment. And this is observation of not only Sheikh Ahmad Ahsai, that was basically founder of Sheikhism, preparing for the coming of the Messiah, that the spiritual system or government cannot be changed. It has to be replaced. And that's why he was expecting this new manifestation to occur. So even foreigners had the same idea in Iran, that is not repairable.